Hi, Diane. I'm very glad to be joined by you today. This is an executive intelligence review interview. I'm Kynan Thistlethwaite and happy to be joined by my guest here. Diane Sare is the new president of the LaRouche Organization. She, of course, has been an independent congressional candidate here in New York State. She ran against Gillibrand this year, and in 2022 ran against Chuck Schumer. Um, so let's get started. So as we're doing this interview now, we're about 4 weeks away from the inauguration of Donald Trump. And you've said, I think in a recent statement, that this is the most dangerous time in history. And now that the collective Biden administration is now seeking to blow up every possibility for Trump to make peace. We've seen that, of course, with the recent ATACMS missiles, the Storm Shadows, this recent assassination on this Russian general Kirillov. So perhaps you can begin by just elaborating on the danger of the strategic crisis and some of the initiatives that the LaRouche Organization and others have taken recently.
Sure. First of all, let me just say that what people have to recognize is that we're in a breakdown of the transatlantic system. That is the system that has been dominant since the end of World War II, and which was very much perverted after the death of Franklin Roosevelt when Truman took over the United States. That geopolitical ordering of the world is at its end. That it really is a kind of Schiller-esque moment, as in the Rutli Oath, where, when there's a limit to a tyrant's power. The people of the global South have rejected colonialism. And I feel very privileged to be in the position that I am as an American citizen and having worked with Lyndon LaRouche for 32 years, starting 37 or 38 years ago, um, knowing his fight to establish a new just economic order. And I think his work, he and his wife Helga met with dozens of heads of state and prominent officials in major nations like China, Russia, India, Nigeria, Brazil, Argentina, etc. What we are seeing is an entirely new system that's coming into being, and the old system simply cannot be maintained. And unfortunately, the attitude of the owners of that system is very much like the attitude of Zeus, which was depicted in Wagner's famous opera Götterdämmerung, The Twilight of the Gods, where Zeus's approach was, well, if I can't rule the world, I'm going to destroy it. I don't care if I destroy virtually everything. And that's what you have coming from this, whatever you want to call it. You can't really call it a Biden administration. It's clear that the guy was senile from the time before he became president in 2021. But whatever it is, it's the facade of a British colonial takeover of the United States, which has been in process since the assassination of Kennedy, at least. And they are determined that incoming President Donald Trump is not going to get off their trajectory to destroy the world. They also actually are insane enough to believe that there is such a thing as winning a nuclear war. So that does put us in an extremely precarious position because these people are disassociated from reality. It's if they've declared that gravity doesn't exist and they're going to lead the people of the world into a march off of the roof of a 110-story building, and it's not going to work out very well.
Right. Um, I want to ask you about this new role that you have now with the LaRouche Organization, just coming off your independent congressional campaigns. Of course, as of right now, we've taken the initiative of going to the U.S. Congress and lobbying for HR 10218, which is of course, basically to stop sending the ATACMS missiles to Ukraine to be used against Russia. But since you're the president now, how do you actually envision this role, and what are your long-term plans for the expansion of the organization?
Well, I think the most important thing is to allow Americans to recognize that they had a great hero in Lyndon LaRouche. They had a brilliant American leader to be proud of, someone who was a universal genius. And if they bother to study his work and his writings, there's no problem we face today which he didn't already forecast and outline a solution to. Now, things are very, very far gone, worse than probably I could have imagined. But nonetheless, human beings are very versatile. Human beings are capable of changing on a dime what they think, their behavior, their policy. So the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche are urgent, and that's why one of the things we've already started is a weekly showing of some of the video product featuring Lyndon LaRouche. This morning, we showed Firewall every Sunday at 10 a.m. Eastern. We'll be showing more video footage of Lyndon LaRouche. I just did a symposium this past Friday with Dennis Small, who was one of LaRouche's co-defendants and spent, I believe, 3 years in prison himself, going through the LaRouche case. A very cursory, because when you begin looking into what they did to LaRouche, you realize that, as Ramsey Clark, former U.S. Attorney General, said, it was the longest running, broadest systemic witch hunt against an individual and association ever. And I mean, including Donald Trump. We had literally dozens of people who were arrested, who went to jail. All of our publications were shut down. LaRouche's home was surrounded by 400 FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, armored vehicle carriers, with the intent to assassinate him. This has not been done on this scale to anyone before or since. What they did to try and prevent Donald Trump to become president was close, but Trump had the position of having been a former president and also having been a billionaire, neither of which LaRouche was, and he used them to fight back. And I'm not trying to take anything away from what he did. The kind of fight that he waged was, frankly, quite heroic. And it inspires Americans, and it gives people a way to say that we can stand up against this incredible injustice. So I think that the name LaRouche has to become a household word, and he needs to become someone in the American political world like J.S. Bach is to the musical world, that people know that this was a Promethean giant, whom Americans should be proud of and should look to in terms of understanding what the proper role of the United States should be in the world. So the LaRouche Organization actually is a 501(c)(4) and can operate a bit internationally, but it's primarily an American organization. And my idea is to make it a force for policy, that we should have a regular presence in Washington, D.C. We should be regularly visiting the offices of the congressman. We should establish chapters in every single state. We will be producing a newspaper, at least on a monthly basis to start, and everybody who gets a membership also gets LaRouche's daily and weekly intelligence service. So my idea is growth, expansion, and education of the American people on the highest level of principle and a fight for policy.
Hmm. I did watch that symposium um, this Friday, and I had to say it was incredibly informative, just in terms of the effect Lynn's ideas actually had on the world. And as you mentioned, we're seeing a fundamental shift taking place right now in the world, from 500 years of colonialism imposed on the nations of the global South to those nations recognizing their own sovereignty and making policies on behalf of their own development. And of course, this was a key highlight of the recent Schiller Institute conference, in the spirit of Beethoven and Schiller. all men shall become brothers, where we heard from such representatives like the former foreign minister of South Africa, Naledi Pandor, who was crucial in bringing the genocide taking place in Gaza to the scrutiny of the international community. So you mentioned that you've worked with LaRouche for nearly 40 years. Can you tell us how his ideas, and from all sorts of things, economy, culture, science, music, are actually shaping the world today?
Well, that's a funny question. The Russian economist Sergei Glaziev, who's the lead advisor of the Eurasian Economic Union, sent a message for the 100th anniversary of LaRouche's birth, 1922, so that was 2022, where he credited LaRouche for contributing many of the ideas that have allowed the global south to participate in the BRICS and the Belt and Road, and I think that's very true. I would say on a personal level, and everybody who knew LaRouche, what you got from him was actually your own identity. He was really the epitome of what Schiller identified in the idea of universal history. And Lyndon, or Lynn as we called him, used to say, "Well, I'm 2,500 years old." And I thought, that's really wild. What do you mean 2,500 years old? But he was very, very conscious of the relationship, the thread between the work of Eratosthenes in 232 BC, measuring the circumference of the earth through and Solon of Athens and Plato and Socrates and the Italian Renaissance and the work of Leibniz, which is someone LaRouche studied and had really mastered by the time he was about 14 years old. Leibniz, along with Nicholas of Cusa, being one of the founders of modern science, and Leibniz was totally fascinated with Asia, with China, with Russia. And in fact, there was a terrible kind of racism where Europe was sending these missionaries to go and civilize the barbarians in China. And Leibniz, meeting with missionaries when they returned and learning something about Chinese culture and Confucius, said that he thought perhaps they should send some Confucian missionaries to civilize Europe, but that also recognized that there was a sort of universal harmony. Confucius had this idea of do unto others as you would have done unto you. Don't do to others what you don't want done to yourself. That is called the Golden Rule in the West, but that was in Confucius. And LaRouche, I think, was very much shaped by his work on Leibniz from an early age. And because he did it so young, he built on it and he had the confidence to challenge many of his teachers and professors. And he had a very strong sense of justice and a strong sense that every single human being on the planet had the right to develop their God given talents and to make a contribution to mankind as a whole. So I think that was his legacy, and it wasn't his legacy as, oh, this is my opinion, and your opinion is just as good as my opinion. No, he said you can measure empirically the success of your economy. You can measure empirically the effect of human creativity on society. You may not be able to see creativity. You may not be able to smell a discovery when that famous light bulb goes off and someone suddenly gains a flash of insight on a thorny paradox they've been working on. But you can figure out how to replicate it, and you can create conditions where the society as a whole can benefit from it. So, in that regard, LaRouche really made a great contribution to the science of human economy, physical economy, by saying that this question of genius and creativity was, in that regard, not only intelligible, but capable of being assimilated to advance society as a whole.
Hmm. It's interesting in talking about Lynn as this kind of global figure, but he was someone who also was an American who uniquely embodied the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence as our founding fathers had actually done. And I want to compare that to the statement by Rear Admiral Thomas Buchanan to the Center of Strategic and International Studies on this question of actually winning a nuclear exchange with Russia. And I'll just quote it. We've quoted it many times on separate programs. I think everybody would agree if we have to have an exchange, then we want to do it in terms that are most acceptable to the United States. So it's terms that are most acceptable to the United States that puts us in a position to continue to lead the world, right? So we're largely viewed as the world leader. Now, you made a point in a recent statement that nowhere in the words of Washington, Franklin, or John Quincy Adams do you see it written that the US is the leader of the free world. Or as Madeleine Albright termed it at one point, we're the indispensable nation. And of course, Lynn, as you noted, had a different conception of American foreign policy, which was rooted in John Quincy Adams' notion of a community of sovereign nation states. So I guess my question would be, how do we actually revive that anti-imperialist notion that's actually rooted in the nation's founding?
I think Americans right now are very stressed out and very fearful and very angry, especially around Christmas, which has been turned into a commercial Lollapalooza, and everybody is supposed to be buying things, and people are hurting, and the cost of everything is through the roof. Um, and they also are worried about the war danger, and they're worried about their own security. Apparently, in only 14 states now can someone making the average income actually afford to buy a house. So there's enormous fear. And then to have someone, Buchanan, I mean, I don't know what's wrong with the guy. He clearly has no grasp on reality. He said in that, he said, yeah, we all say nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. But if we had one, well, we'd want to win, right? I mean, he clearly has no clue about what a nuclear war even means. And I don't know how you get into that position being so clueless, but maybe that's a prerequisite under this administration. We saw, you remember in New York, two years ago, the city of New York put out a public service announcement about how to survive a nuclear war. We see this woman standing in front of a brownstone in Harlem saying, "Don't ask me how it happened, but the big one has happened. We've been hit by a nuclear bomb." And you wonder, how could anyone stand outside their house if a nuclear, I mean, she would have just been a shadow on the sidewalk. That would have been it. And she says, if you happen to be outside when the blast occurred, like as if you would still be there at all, or maybe if you're a few miles away, you would be there, but your skin would all be hanging off or something. Go inside, take off your outer garments and wash them. And who do they think they're fooling? Most people don't believe this, but some of them do. So, this idea that a nuclear war is winnable, that it can be won, I've heard that some circles are saying, well, yeah, there will be a nuclear winter, but it won't be for 3 years. It's only going to be a couple months, and 30% of the population will survive. Now, what kind of person is prepared to let 70% of the world's population die? What kind of sickness is that? So, we have a ruling class that is completely out of reality, and they're being trounced. They're being defeated. Governments are falling. In Europe, we saw that with Scholz and no confidence vote. We saw that in France. The US is really what that was with the defeat of Kamala Harris and Biden. The question is, how do we guarantee that what comes after will be better? And that's where LaRouche's work and writing comes in. And that's where everyone watching this, you and your activity, American citizens have more power than almost anyone on the planet. We just aren't using it. The American people have to use that power to insist that our nation stop carrying out policies which are completely destructive of the future.
Yeah, just going back to that PSA in New York, I mean, it reminds you of some of the stories, people who lived in the 80s would tell you, that, these alerts that people issued, if there is a nuclear attack, you go under your table in your school or something. But this is, just far more ridiculous. I want to touch on your expertise in culture and music. You, of course, founded the Schiller Institute New York City Chorus, and I think you directed that chorus for nearly 10 years. Um, and if I'm remembering this right, LaRouche, at the time that the Manhattan Project was being formed, had said that at some point that the organization needed to build a 10,000 person chorus in New York City. I think that's the number he gave, right?
What I remember is 5,000, but what
5,000. Okay.
but who's counting? 10,000, 5,000? Yeah, that's what he said. Um, and that was pretty wild, and I had no idea really what he was talking about, although when the chorus, we're now recovering from the COVID lockdown period, etcetera. But there was, a point just before that where whenever we would hold a concert, probably 2/3 of the audience had been in the chorus at one point or another. So if he meant it in terms of a few thousand people having participated, we're probably at 2 or 3,000 now, but I actually think that's a cop out, and he probably intended for us to have 5,000 people singing together simultaneously. Um, and that did happen, in 1868 or 69. I think it was in 1869, right after General Grant was elected president. They had a jubilee, and Lynn must have been aware of this. I was not, but some people from the Union Army, particularly P.S. Gilmore, who was one of the band directors for the Union Army, and I suspect General Grant, decided they had to unify the country, and they were going to do it through music, and they were going to hold a peace jubilee, 6 days of classical music at a giant built for the occasion stadium in Massachusetts. It was the largest structure built in the United States at that time. It held, I think, 40,000 people. They had a chorus of 10,000 voices, an orchestra of 1,000. They had a bass drum that was 25 feet in diameter, and they got some guy at the New England Conservatory of Music, which is where I happen to have gone to school, to send out letters to, actually, I think they did it through the fire departments, with books of repertoire. They wanted to create choruses in every single city and town across the United States. And it included a cover letter of how many sopranos, altos, tenors, and basses you needed, that you had to find an accompanist, you had to find a librarian, and you need people who have some proficiency in reading music. And then we're all going to come together and sing in this amazing jubilee. And they did another one later. They actually also did one after the end of World War I. What an amazing thing. And in fact, it was the case throughout, I think, most of the United States. I know certainly in New York and New Jersey, most major industrial corporations actually had a chorus as well. Or you can think of the paintings by Norman Rockwell, the barbershop, which is closed for the day. It's after 5, and you look through and you see in the back room they're sitting there with violins. They have a string quartet. Or the ads for the Curtiss Wright factory, which made airplanes for World War II. And in the ad for the factory, they have a family gathered around the mother playing the piano, and everybody is singing. I think this was just a very important part of the average person's life. Music is a language. It should be everybody's first or second language after, if you're an American, after English. We have many immigrants, so maybe people speak Spanish, Italian, Russian, some other language, English, and music. Everybody should be proficient in a basic degree in music. It's a whole other dimension of access to your mind and language.
Yeah. I just mentioned that because, of course, we had this extraordinary event on October 26th with multiple people from the military side that we've been working with, Scott Ritter, Colonel Larry Wilkerson, Dennis Fritz, and others, who have been voices for peace in the recent period. But it was quite striking because a large component of the event was, of course, the music, the choral performances, the African American spirituals, the performance of Dvorak's American String Quartet, and there were even some international performances. And you got to see there why this organization stresses that there needs to be a cultural component to the peace movement, and why it actually has to be rooted in classical culture. And I know Professor Norman Finkelstein at one of our campaign events, he had actually talked about reviving singing in the peace movement. So maybe you could, I don't know if you have any extra comments on that, aside from what you already said.
Well, singing brings people together. It drives out fear, and it allows you to access a part of yourself which is not merely in the physical domain. So that's why I think it helps you to transcend whatever fear about what might be done to your physical body, whether it's being beaten, fire hosed, getting arrested, and to place your identity in something which is eternal. And it's very important. And I think it's a terrible loss. What he pointed out is from the Black Lives Matter demonstrations after the death of George Floyd till the anti-genocide rallies, there is no singing. And he's working on it. And I know Jewish Voice for Peace has been doing a lot of singing, and I concur. It's something extremely important.
Okay. So we're coming up on the end. I just have one more question for you, and of course, you could throw in whatever final thoughts you have. But since we're an independent congressional candidate, I would just ask you what your advice would be to people who are running now or seeking to run for office in the United States. We saw uniquely the independent candidacies of people like Dennis Kucinich, Ben Wesley in Connecticut. But what would be your advice to people?
Well, what Lyndon LaRouche said to us all the time is don't chase votes. The elections are completely rigged at this moment. There's no point in sugarcoating it unless you're a billionaire or going to suck up to the crooks running the show or get in bed with the British imperial system Zionist lobby. Chances are they're not going to allow you to get elected. That doesn't mean you shouldn't run for office. You should run for office because your voice is needed. And if you start from the standpoint that the process at the moment, and I'm not saying it's should be left that way. In fact, I'm in a lawsuit myself right now about election fraud, and I hope they're going to do something about it. But I'm saying the point is not to try and win votes. The point is to be a voice of leadership, to tell the truth. We don't have enough of those voices. And if you conduct yourself as the incumbent congressman, or in my case, US Senator, uh, should have conducted herself in this case, then you provide a counterpole of leadership and you begin to create a standard so that the American people can be perhaps a bit better at making judgments about whom they would like to lead them.
Thank you for that. So, yeah, I think we can just close it off here. It's great having you on, and we will see you next time, hopefully.
Yes, I hope so. Thank you very much.
Thank you.